Casi supplementari determinano un surplus di spesa di energie. La conclusione e il gol di Trajkovski.
On March 24th, 2022, Italy failed to qualify for the World Cup in Qatar. It was the second straight time they missed out. Prior, this was a country with 4 World Cup titles to their name, with the most recent one going back only 4 tournaments ago. So what happened? Well, to figure that out, we gotta go a little back. The early beginnings of football in Italy go all the way back to the Middle Ages, when an early form of the sport called calcio storico originated in Florence. This version of the sport was pretty much the first ever form of CONMEBOL ball, or actually no, CONCACAF ball, but it was only for the aristocrats and the soldiers, so the sport quickly faded into irrelevance. However, into the late 1800s, a modern version of the game we all know and love today was slowly being introduced by... we've already seen it in 2 video essays, the English! Through port cities, Englishmen living abroad slowly spread the word of association football and even created Genoa Cricket Football Club in 1893. In 1898, the Federazione Italiana del Football was formed and then recognized by FIFA in 1905. That same year saw the federation move its headquarters from Turin to Milan and then change its name 4 years later to the Federazione Italiana Gioco Calcio. The FIGC then put together the first official Italian national team, which would go on to beat France in 1910. In that match, they donned a neutral white, but that didn't last long, as at the beginning of the following year, the Italian national team chose to wear a color symbolic to the Casa Savoia lineage, the ruling dynasty in Italy at the time. Over time, however, this shade of blue shed its monarchic roots and became more of a symbol for footballing pride. Gli Azzurri, or the Blues in English, hosted and won the World Cup in 1934. It was the second ever running of the tournament, and also one of the earliest forms of sports washing. The Italians then won the next tournament in 1938, right before the so-called Il Duce was displayed like one of those ducks at a Chinese restaurant. So it has come to my attention that when you say Gli Azzurri, the G is silent. I learned this only about a few weeks ago, so this is the one thing I'll apologize for, Italians. However, after World War II, Italy suffered a bit of a decline due to other countries becoming more competitive through star players and innovative tactics. So in an effort to catch up, clubs in the country started to adopt a modernized defensive style of football called catenaccio. This was heavily implemented throughout the late 50s into the early 60s and resulted in the development of many exceptional defenders, including Tarcisio Bergnic and Giacinto Facchetti of the Grande Inter team that won 2 European Cups. That success also translated onto the world stage, with the Italians triumphing in Euro 1968. However, catenaccio had its weaknesses, and slowly but surely, this brand of dull defensive football met its reckoning. Fluid attacking football. In the 1967 European Cup final, Grande Inter lost to a free-flowing Celtic side. Then in the 1970 World Cup final, Italy was dismantled 4-1 by Brazil's Joga Bonito. And by the 70s, Ajax's total football made it prehistoric. And so the Italians went back to the lab. What if we combat fluid attacking football with fluid defensive football? Genius! From there, Italian football dominated once more thanks to the zona mista tactic, and as a cherry on top, Gli Azzurri got their revenge against Brazil and then beat West Germany to win the World Cup in 1982. The success of zona mista was pretty short-lived, however, as the reigning champs were knocked out in the last 16 of the very next World Cup. So you might be wondering, what's the secret that's being revealed in this video essay? Y'all might remember 2 years ago, I was able to make my dream trip come true. I loved every single second of this country, to the point that I made a 1-hour-long vlog. I promise at some point we'll get the second vlog. The thing is though, that trip would have never happened had it not been for all the love you guys showed on one of my favorite video essays I've ever made on this channel. And since that day, when I landed in Tokyo for the first time in my entire life, I have always wanted to find a way to give back to you guys. And today, I can finally make that happen. I recently partnered with Tokyo Dome City to give away a free trip to Japan. You heard that right. One lucky person will have their round-trip flight completely covered and will be staying at this beautiful, luxurious premium room at Tokyo Dome Hotel for 3 nights. To enter this giveaway, all you have to do is like this pinned post on my Instagram, @Macwell. There will also be a link in the description, but also you need to follow @Explore Tokyo Dome City on Instagram, because no winner will actually be announced until they hit 25,000 followers. I'm going to be mentioning this giveaway throughout the entirety of December, by the way, so it gives many opportunities for people to be reminded of this giveaway and the fact that they could get a free trip to Japan. So real quick, again, this is all you gotta do. Like the pinned post on my Instagram at Macwell. There will also be a link in the description to that post. And get at Explore Tokyo Dome City on Instagram to 25,000 followers. Merry Christmas, fellas. Go get yourself a Japan trip. In 1990, Italy would host the World Cup for the first time since that tournament they probably rigged. This was a great opportunity for not only Italian football, but the country itself. However, every stadium was not up to standards, and to put it lightly, looked shit. The main reason why was because city councils who owned these stadiums were always very reluctant on renovating, but now there was a real incentive: tourism. Lots of it. So with the green light, Italy's World Cup committee built 2 new stadiums and renovated 10 more. But because none of these stadiums had seen any improvements in almost 60 years, multiple stadiums had to be flat out rebuilt. So as a whole, the Italia 90 project costed almost 4 billion euros. This was way over budget, but I mean, listen, this is Italy we're talking about here, so there was definitely some corruption involved.
In 1991, I was shot 8 times by the Gambino family after trying to allocate funds for the Stadio Renzo Barbera.
But at the same time, the planning for all of this was just downright terrible. There were Spider-Man across the Spider-Verse levels of time constraints, which resulted in unfinished projects like this hotel in Milan, and a partial stadium collapse in Palermo that took the lives of a few severely underpaid workers. But quite like Spider-Verse, somehow Italy got everything done in time, and World Cup 1990 was a great success, with Liazzurri finishing 3rd. Welcome to Napoli, a city on the coast where the history-rich beauty you see is a rose-tinted contrast to the bleak quality of life within the neighborhoods themselves. Napoli sits in the south, a region that throughout history has been heavily looked down upon by the wealthier northerners who saw southerners as barbaric and uncivilized. It was these attitudes towards the south after the unification of Italy in 1861 that gave a heavily northern-influenced parliament an excuse to neglect their neighbors below. Because of this, unemployment skyrocketed, with most jobs moving to the north, poverty deepened, and as desperation grew, the Camorra mafia and corrupt officials rose to power. Together, they bled the city dry. They even embezzled billions meant for rebuilding after an earthquake that had killed thousands. In Napoli, love may be king, though misery ruled the empire. But on July 5th, 1984, none of that mattered anymore, for their savior had arrived. Despite the city being one of the poorest in Western Europe, the owner of SCC Napoli, the Bank of Napoli, probably the Camorra, and even the damn people pitched in what they could to welcome to the club the greatest player in the world, Diego Maradona. And just 3 years later, Diego returned the favor by winning the club its first ever Scudetto. No longer was Maradona just the greatest player on the planet. He was now a symbol of Neapolitan pride and a defiance against those who looked down on it. Although Serie A was already a top league, Diego Maradona brought international attention that would quickly be capitalized upon by figures across the country keen on increasing their own influence through Calcio. Back in the olden days, as my dad would say, football clubs weren't as commercialized as they are now. If you were a relatively successful businessman and had a dream, you could easily own a football club. And with the Italian economic boom coinciding with the Maradona effect, many suits started pumping money into clubs without any hesitation, like they were American politicians committing insider trading fraud during COVID. Founded in 1889, AC Milan already had 10 Scudetti by 1979. But after a match-fixing scandal in 1980, their performances took a nosedive, with the club on the brink of collapse by 1986. Enter Silvio Berlusconi, a media tycoon with political aspirations who saw what saving a club could do for one's image. However, Berlu wanted more than just a couple trophies. He wanted a dynasty, which he could use to blind people from his blatant monopolization and censorship of Italian media. Over the next decade, Silvio threw the bank at Milan, buying the likes of Marco van Basten, Frank Rijkaard, Ruud Gullit, Marcel Desailly, George Weah, Indonesia's current head coach, Andriy Shevchenko. And throughout the late 80s to late 90s, Silvio's stars would go on to win Milan 6 Scudetti. However, they weren't the only ones having fun. Their rivals, Internazionale, were another big reason Serie A's popularity popularity initially surged, as in 1989, the club signed Lothar Matthäus, who went on to win the Ballon d'Or just 2 years later. However, after some underwhelming seasons, the club was taken over in 1995 by oil tycoon Massimo Moratti. He would go on to bring even more eyes over to Serie A after breaking the world transfer record to sign striker Ronaldo. But in the years that followed, Ronaldo was never the same player after recurring knee injuries, the club's coaching carousel was extremely volatile, and as a result, Inter ended the 90s domestically dry. Going back to 1979, years before the Maradona magic and the Silvio storm, UC Sampdoria was acquired by oil businessman Paolo Mantovani, and with this significant investment, Sampdoria returned to Serie A in 1982, and then won their first and only Scudetto in 1991 with the squad that included Gianluca Vialli and Roberto Mancini. AC Parma promoted to Serie A for the first time in 1990, and knew they weren't going back down thanks to the brand new cash cow they could milk. And milk it they did. Parma was absolutely star-studded, and over the next decade and more, they went on to win a Supercoppa and 3 Coppa Italias. Now, while Parmalat pumped their cream into a club, AC Fiorentina's owner was subsequently run out of their club after he sold star striker Roberto Baggio to rivals Juventus. The savior this time? A film producer. Like many, Mario Cecchi Gori provided immediate stability for a club in financial disarray, and then balled out in the transfer windows, bringing in superstars like Gabriel Batistuta and Rui Costa, who helped the club win a Supercoppa and 2 Coppa Italias. In 1992, food company Sirio pulled SS Lazio out of the darkness and sent the club into its most successful period to date, winning 2 Coppa Italias and their second ever Scudetto in 2000. This was all thanks to their new owner Sergio Cragnotti, who spent big for stars like Pavel Nedved and Juan Sebastian Veron. He even broke the world transfer record in 2000 to acquire prolific striker Hernan Crespo. In general, the 90s saw Italian clubs dominate the transfer window, oftentimes topping charts for the most expensive transfer of the year. And the club who did that the most was Juventus, who over the decade bought world-class players like the aforementioned Roberto Baggio, Didier Deschamps, Edgar Davids, and even Zinedine Zidane. Ironically enough though, Juve didn't have a change in ownership because their current one provided way more financial stability than most of the other owners, simply because they were the only ones who didn't settle in one specialty. Either way though, because of all these owners with access to what seemed to be a never-ending money faucet the way they were spending like a porn addict on OnlyFans, the destination for the best players in the world was now Italy. Each top club had multiple, and nothing encapsulated this world dominance more than the country's European record in this era. Italian clubs won just about everything in Europe: Cup Winners' Cups, Super Cups, UEFA Cups, and of course the Champions League, where Milan and Juve led the charge with 4 in total. And this absolute world domination also coincided with the rise of satellite TV and global markets, which naturally meant even more eyes on Serie A, resulting in clubs earning massive bags going to the 2000s. Everything in Italian football didn't just seem like it was perfect, it was perfect. Almost too perfect. Defender Paolo Maldini was 16 when he made his debut for Milan right out of their academy in 1984 and quickly cemented himself as a key starter. By age 22, the defender made his World Cup debut in Italia 90, where he was key to his team's record-breaking run of 5 consecutive clean sheets. Maldini was called up again for World Cup 1994, this time as vice-captain, and once more he proved unbeatable in the back. However, because of their underwhelming attack, Italy barely made it out of their group and then found themselves 1-0 down to Nigeria early in the knockout stage. But then, everything changed with the arrival of the divine ponytail. Roberto Baggio scored a brace versus Nigeria and then single-handedly carried the Italians to the final with 3 more decisive goals. Fast forward to penalties after a goalless 120, Italy once again called upon their savior. And he missed. Italy was probably gonna lose anyway, but this one moment would unfairly cast a shadow over Baggio's illustrious career. Forever. Italy's World Cup 1998 team consisted of many players with a lot of promise, but it wasn't their time just yet. 4 years later, however, oh, they bloomed. The Italians now had Gigi Buffon in net, Alessandro Nesta and Fabio Cannavaro to protect him. There were fantastic midfielders like Gianluca Zambrotta and Gennaro Gattuso.
Sometimes maybe good, sometimes maybe shit.
Up top, there were deadly options like Christian Vieri, Francesco Totti, and Alessandro Del Piero. And finally, Liazzurri had Paolo Maldini with all his wisdom, captaining in his last ever World Cup. There was no doubt anymore. Nothing could stop this team. Besides one of the most corrupt games in this tournament's history. In their last 16 game versus South Korea, the Italians could literally be beaten and bloodied, and all the ref would do is just stand there nonchalantly. And when Italy was just about to score a golden goal to advance, the play was called offside. Even though it clearly wasn't. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, Alright, let's try this again. Going into World Cup 2006, the Italians had a strong squad with many of the same players from the Seoul Screwjob, with the addition of world-class midfielder Andrea Pirlo and a new head coach with plenty of club success in Marcelo Lippi. And now with no Maldini anymore, a fearless and bald Fabio Cannavaro would step up to the occasion and lead Italy to the final, conceding just one goal throughout the whole tournament. Going into the final though, the Italians didn't have a distinct X-factor like France's Zinedine Zidane. However, they were together, they were resilient, but most importantly, they had defender Marco Materazzi who rage-baited Zidane in extra time. The game then went to penalties, and after 5 perfect attempts, Italy was officially back on top of the world again. Acquiring world-class players and managers naturally came with ungodly expenses, transfer fees, wages, all funded by money these owners didn't actually have. You see, the business owners who came in the 90s weren't too far off the degenerates you see in Vegas, because all of this spending was just a chase for glory. Any expenses, anything they owed would just be paid off by trophies. But like gambling, many clubs weren't as successful as they'd hoped, and behind the scenes were generating metric fuck tons of debt they couldn't actually pay off. After Maradona left, Napoli's revenues decreased significantly. The club was forced to sell all of its best players, and by 2004 they went bankrupt. There was also FC Torino, home of the legendary Grande Torino team that won 4 straight titles in the late 40s. But after failing to achieve anything after copious amounts of spending, they too went under in 2005. However, for other clubs in trouble, they had a solution. Financial fraud. While Lazio was celebrating their second ever Scudetto, their owner Sergio Cragnotti and, allegedly, the Bank of Rome were deceiving over 30,000 investors into buying junk bonds from Lazio's parent company Sirio with the promise of big returns. However, just 4 years later, Sirio defaulted, and many lost their savings because the company couldn't pay off the over 1.1 billion euros worth of bonds they owed. Meanwhile, on the club side of things, Lazio had to sell its best players, failed to pay player wages, and then had to be saved from bankruptcy by a tax agency. After Fiorentina's owner, Mario Cecchi Gori, suddenly passed away in 1993, his son Vito took over, and this guy was just a dumbass. Despite Fiorentina's growing debt, Vito decided it would be in the best interest of his father's film empire to create a TV channel that would rival Italy's top 2. It failed miserably. Now in even more debt, Vito allegedly stole over 32 million from the club to save his ass, and in the same year of 2002, AC Fiorentina went bankrupt. However, this all pales in comparison to the shit that AC Parma's owners were doing. While Parma were being bridesmaids of Serie A and 2-time UEFA Cup winners in the late 90s, their parent company Parmalat was funneling over 14 billion euros of debt through more than 200 shell companies across countries with looser financial regulations. Eventually, Parmalat was exposed for this in 2003, filed for bankruptcy, and a year later AC Parma was no more. So within a matter of 5 years, there were only 4 giants left standing, and even they were struggling financially. Fortunately though, they were still experiencing great amounts of success, so as long as they keep winning, the money will flow, and everything will be just fine. Before we go any further, let me give you guys a little econ lesson. Now, I dropped out of college, so all the information that I'm going to be giving to you is from a friend who actually graduated with a degree. When you borrow money from the bank, you'll be provided an interest rate, which is what you pay in addition to repaying what you borrowed. Interest rates are basically how banks make their money, and each one is different depending on the person. They can also determine what loans people are qualified for. Now, for video essay's sake, let's just use an example of someone we've already talked about. Take Callisto Tanzi, the founder of Parmalat, someone who is incredibly untrustworthy and also in 14 billion euros of debt. Imagining if the bank knew, he would not qualify for any loan and would be in jail. But if he was able to borrow money, he'd have to pay a larger interest rate because there's more of a risk that the bank loses money because he can't pay them back. Now imagine a scenario where Callisto has the same interest rate as someone who is more trustworthy. In 1999, the European Union launched a new currency called the euro. It was a landmark achievement for the whole continent as the currency made trading with other EU members so much more efficient. But more importantly, because the European Central Bank set just one interest rate for all financial institutions that loan money to governments, this meant a country like Italy, who had a lower credit rating, could access really nice loans they normally wouldn't be qualified for from banks in countries with higher credit ratings. And this was amazing for the Italians, who were able to lower tax rates because the country was going absolutely ham in the bank. Much like the clubs that were spending big though, the country was generating more and more debt that they couldn't actually pay off. Fortunately though, the euro was absolutely flourishing, so as long as that money faucet kept flowing, everything would be just fine. In late 2008, the world experienced a global crisis that saw financial institutions all over Europe struggling to survive. This led to the Eurozone crisis a year later, which resulted in these institutions asking for their money back. So now all of a sudden, Italy was being asked to pay back all their loans they were granted, which they couldn't, and as a result, their debt skyrocketed. As a consequence, Italy had to increase taxes, and the government made budget cuts that led Italian football going full send into a complete shit show. Commercial revenue dropped, so clubs now had to rely on matchday revenue. However, with everyone now having bigger worries to deal with, ticket sales and merch took a dive as well. This was very much the last thing any club wanted to see happen, as their mountains of debt had become a lot more unmanageable now. For lower division clubs in particular, it got so bad that in order to delay the inevitable, some clubs would pay off loans with other loans. But it wasn't just them suffering. Higher taxes also meant less consumer spending in general, so now you had the big companies who own giants being a lot more cautious because they too were losing money. Roma was experiencing their best decade since the 80s, but their owners had been drowning in debt for a while, and it took a turn for the worse with the Eurozone crisis. Over in Milan, Silvio Berlusconi was more focused on his political aspirations and actually became Prime Minister of Italy in 2008, so, you know, his plan worked, I guess. He was already investing less into his club, but with the effects of not only recession, but also the decline of TV, the Rossoneri found themselves having to sell star players to clear out their insanely expensive wage bill. After signing for just 8.5 million euros in 2003, Kaká became a Ballon d'Or winning superstar at the club, but in 2009 he was shipped out to Real Madrid even though he didn't want the move. However, there was still Thiago Silva and Zlatan Ibrahimovic who played key roles for Milan's Scudetto winning season in 2010-11, but just one summer later they were both sold to PSG and Milan would not win another title for the next decade. But how about a distraction from all this pain, eh? Zamina mina, waka waka, The Italians entered World Cup 2010 with an aging squad that critics were skeptical of. It also didn't help that Italy struggled a good bit in their qualification campaign. Nonetheless, head coach Marcello Lippi was confident his team could repeat, saying, quote, "Whenever a World Cup comes around, everyone wants to get in their last say. Last time, everyone joined in as we moved along, but this time, we're not going to allow anyone to jump on the bandwagon."
A good side of this, now they retreat. The header's in! Paraguay in front!
Oh, and a touch in! New Zealand remarkably!
And it's the end for Italy. The defending champions are out of the World Cup.
Meanwhile, back home in good old Italia, Inter had just come off winning the 2009-10 Champions League thanks in large part to Jose Mourinho. However, just like their rivals, they too were sailing with a boatload of debt generated by their wage bill. This was made worse by the fact that most of the highest paid players were older, which made it a lot harder for both Inter and Milan to sell them. But on top of this, if you remember from the 1990 section, neither club owned their stadium. Instead, they had to pay the city to rent it out, and that only created even more debt. Nevertheless, there was still hope for these stadiums, a bid for Euro 2016, which would force these city officials to budge once again. Unfortunately, Italy's bid was so shit it was eliminated by Turkey in the first round. All that said, clubs like Milan, Inter, and Juventus were all still the highest earners in their country. Key word: country. But then in 2011, UEFA introduced the, hey, you can't just keep spiraling into debt for a chance at glory, like at some point you gotta pay this off. This is low-key some kind of form of fraud. Rule, better known as financial fair play. But no worries, Serie A still had one of the best TV revenues, so at least these giants could still fall upon that. Not only was Italian football struggling financially, there were two separate corruption scandals that caused many different entities to lose trust in the leagues. Fan violence was also plaguing Calcio, and that fear of safety resulted in many stadiums struggling for attendance. Oh yeah, and since this is Italy we're talking about, racism. A lot of it. And because the best talents were no longer in Italy, there was no Zidane nor Kaká to protect the league's reputation from fans doing monkey chants anymore. So when it came time to renew TV rights, there was significantly less money than before. To add salt to that wound, Serie A never bothered to learn from its past mistakes and didn't capitalize on the age of social media while their competitors exploded in popularity. On a positive at least, Juve was able to soften the blow after opening a new stadium. It had less capacity, but generated more revenue because they owned it. Italy entered World Cup 2014 with a bunch of Juve players who were behind the club's recent domestic dominance, including Gigi Buffon, Leo Bonucci, Giorgio Chiellini, Claudio Marchisio, and Grandpa Pirlo. There was also some pretty promising players in Marco Verratti, Lorenzo Insigne, Ciro Immobile, and the best of the bunch, Mario Balotelli, who impressed a ton in Euro 2012. Speaking of which, expectations were pretty high for the Italians after they reached the final of that tournament under new manager Cesare Prandelli. However, people seem to have forgotten that in the final, the Italians were dished out like tapas by Spain. Also behind the scenes, there was quite some tension between Prandelli and Balotelli. Either way, in their opener, Italy beat England 2-1 with Balo behind the winner, but I mean, this was pre-2016 England, so all this really did was inflate players' heads. They went on to underestimate Costa Rica, fucked around, and then found out. Gliazzurri somehow still didn't learn their lesson, and went into their last group game versus Uruguay playing for a draw to advance. However, that bit them back in the ass both figuratively and literally kinda, and after another group stage exit for the Italians, Prandelli was sacked, and the Federation President Giancarlo Abete resigned. Surely this doesn't get any worse though. I said... Financial fair play put Massimo Moratti's philosophy of debt wins championships to sleep with a 1-2 punch, and just 3 years later after winning all big years, Inter were no longer in the Champions League, having sold their best players every season. Moratti realized this was no longer a sustainable project for him and sold the club in late 2013. Milan was experiencing a similar fate. After selling their best players to make up the deficit, the squad became so weak that it would fail to qualify for the Champions League in 2014. Meanwhile, Silvio was focusing even more on his political career, and felt like he could no longer compete with the influx of new money entering the sport. 3 years later, Silvio gave up entirely, sold the club to Chinese investor Li Yonghong, and that all fell apart faster than the average situationship in New York City.
Grazie. Quando è che mi presenti con noi? No, solo per vederla, io sono vecchio, non ce la fa. Però mi piacerebbe perché tutti dicono che è la più bella.
Belu did come back to Italian football a few years later with AC Monza, and in the form of a pep talk, he once promised players, and I quote, a bus full of whores. So pretty much by 2017, besides Juve, everyone was in the trenches swimming in an endless sea of red. This had become so bad to the point where most clubs started to aggressively prioritize short-term results to stay afloat. Even Milan and Inter had to focus on finding instant impact players, and mind you, because this was also on a very strict budget due to FFP, and whatever shit show was unfolding at the time, yeah. And because of this heavy reliance on results, clubs completely neglected their youth talent. Instead of investing into something cringe like player development, all Serie A clubs would do is just send their players into what I like to call the predatory loan gauntlet, where Italian clubs would loan out a promising young player to lower tier sides for 5 years straight, or even longer, and destroy any kind of hope that player ever had of turning into anything besides an accountant. This single-handedly killed any promising generation for this country, and nothing reflected that more than the national team. In Euro 2016, Italy reached the quarterfinals, which was pretty damn impressive because they did this all without star midfielder Marco Verratti. Because Jesus H. Christ, man, outside the pristine defense and Daniele De Rossi, this team was aggressively mid. Italy was out here starting players like Eder, Simone Zaza, and 30-year-old Graziano Pella. But despite the amalgamation of average on display, Antonio Conte's genius tactics led this team to wins versus Belgium's golden generation, Spain, and nearly Germany if Zaza didn't send a missile towards Poland and Pella didn't tell Neuer he would lob it over him and then proceed to do this shit.
Yeah, I prefer to kill him.
However, after doing miracles with the Italian national team equivalent of Olive Garden, Antonio Conte does the typical I'm tired gimmick and moves to greener pastures. This was a big blow for Gliazzurri with the 2018 World Cup qualifiers on the horizon. And because of that heinous showing back in 2014, Italy had dropped out of the top 10 in FIFA rankings, were placed pot 2, and were drawn with Spain. But quite honestly, Italy had something worse than Spain to deal with. Their new head coach. The Federation replaced Conte with Gian Piero Ventura, who was described by new FIGC president Carlo Tavecchio as, quote, innovative, with limitless experience who had helped many players like Ciro Immobile, Andrea Bellotti, and Alessio Cerci reach the national side. He was the oldest coach Italy had ever hired. When Ventura first came in, he wanted to utilize the country's young promising talents, as a lot of the main core was geriatric, to put it best.
Oh, a mistake by Buffon, a terrible mistake!
But as we all know, There wasn't really any to begin with. Ventura also enjoyed most of his success at Torino through his 4-2-4 formation that unlocked aggressive wingers to do his bidding. He went on to deploy the national team in that same setup, but as the famous saying I just made up goes, just because you use tomato ketchup as your base doesn't mean it's pizza. None of the players fit the system. Also, Italy had none of the wingers that were essential to this tactic, and worse of all, cracks in the system were beginning to show. The critiques got louder, but Ventura was adamant even after being banished to the playoff round because he refused to put more than 2 midfielders up against a team whose very identity is its midfield. However, after an embarrassing draw with 85th ranked Macedonia that confirmed Italy's spot in the playoff round, the players reportedly had enough and staged a revolution for the return of the 3-5-2 formation that made the team look so fluid during the Conte days. Eventually, Ventura gave in to these demands for the playoff first leg in Sweden, but by that point, it was way too late as the Azzurri struggled to get out of second gear and conceded the only goal of the game. This was by no means the end of the world though, as the return leg would be in Italy, and better yet, amongst the old and crusty was a newly improved Lorenzo Insigne. Coming off a breakout season of 18 goals and 9 assists for Napoli, this was exactly the guy Italy needed to get out of this mess. Wait a minute, where is he? One thing I failed to mention earlier was that a few weeks prior, Lorenzo Insigne had fucked Ventura's wife. He didn't actually, but the way Ventura put his own bias ahead of the national team's success to this extreme was mind-boggling. In the first leg, Ventura subbed Insigne on in the 76th minute, and then in the must-win game versus Sweden, Insigne didn't even see the pitch! This was all so ridiculous that when Italy still needed a goal and Ventura called up from the bench center defensive midfielder De Rossi, the now 34-year-old literally pointed to Insigne. There's no knowing exactly how much of an impact Insigne could have had, but without his creativity, Italy's attack went as well as the gun debate did for Charlie Kirk as they held 76% of the possession, created just 6 shots on target, but more importantly, failed to score in a whole 90 minutes. And thus, it was official. Italy had failed to qualify for the World Cup for the first time in over 50 years. This was by and large the biggest embarrassment to Italian football, which is really saying a lot here. But after the game, legendary keeper Gigi Buffon was full of remorse. This country meant everything to him, and with this being his last game for the national team, the outcome left him a tear-filled mess. Meanwhile, Ventura was flexing. My record is one of the best of the last 40 years. I lost 2 games in 2 years. Brother, you just failed to qualify for the World Cup with Italy. And the snake oil salesman Tavecchio would also walk out the door because while blatant racism during a re-election campaign is just fine, failing to qualify for the World Cup is where the Federation draws the line. Now really in the gutter, the FIGC decided to have a facelift during the World Cup year. They elected former Serie C president Gabriele Gravina and then appointed Roberto Mancini as the new head coach. Mancini was brilliant as a player, but had a lot of problems with his character that contributed to his self-exile from the Azzurri before the World Cup in 1994. And his presence might have given Italy the edge in that final if not for his lack of maturity. But now, years later, he had a second chance to help his country from the sidelines where he once refused to stand. It was a masterclass move from the Federation, as the fire in Mancini's soul inspired a group of players haunted by failure and desperate to restore faith in a whole country. So with some older and established players like Chiellini, Bonucci, Spinazzola, Jorginho, Verratti, Insigne, Immobile, and some newer blood like goalkeeper Gigi Donnarumma, midfielder Manuel Locatelli, midfielder Nicolo Barella, and forward Federico Chiesa, Italy smoked everyone in their path and went unbeaten through 27 straight games stretching from late 2018 to mid-2021. This momentum continued into the Euros, where Federico Chiesa and the Azzurri triumphed all, and with Måneskin winning Eurovision and topping the charts, summer 2021 was officially dubbed Spaghetti Mafia Summer. Going into World Cup 2022 qualifiers with a Euro title, many believed that Italy was back and that they would return to the big dance. However, just months after their Euro Cinderella run, the Azzurri were held to a draw versus Bulgaria at home and then dropped points again versus Switzerland after so-called Ballon d'Or favorite Jorginho missed a penalty. Nevertheless, the Spaghetti Mafia returned to winning ways a few days later with a 5-0 pummeling of Lithuania. But then a month later, the struggles continued with Italy conceding an early goal from the Swiss at home. Now, Gli Azzurri were really in trouble, as that saw them drop down to the playoff spot in the group. But nevertheless, they equalized, and then with a minute left in stoppage time, Jorginho was given an opportunity to redeem himself.
Jorginho over the bar!
Okay, what the fuck happened? This team literally just won the pinnacle of European tournaments like a few months ago. After Italy's triumph, people kind of forgot that tournaments are more like a sprint, whereas World Cup qualifiers are spread out like a marathon. Not to mention, a good amount of the Azzurri's Euro matches were in Rome because UEFA insisted on their shitty logistical nightmare coming to life. Also, Mancini was brought in to have a good run in the Euros, so while there were expectations, there wasn't any of that kind of same urgency you get with the World Cup qualifiers. And because of the expectations to qualify being ramped up tenfold by a combination of Euro triumph and the trauma of 2017, the pressure got way too much and players started buckling under it. Even then though, the top two were still tied on points with Italy in first. So with one qualifier left, all the Italians needed to do to return to the big show was beat Northern Ireland. And they couldn't even do that. Switzerland, on the other hand, dismantled Bulgaria, so once more Italy would have to settle for the runners-up spot, and lucky them, UEFA decided to turn the playoff round into a simulation of hell itself. As opposed to the past when there was just a single two-legged tie, the new playoff system split teams into groups of 4 called paths. In each path there would be a semi-final and a final. The winner of the final would book their ticket to Qatar. This was not ideal for an Italian team slowly collapsing under pressure, but amongst most of the competition, they were still one of the strongest. So as long as they didn't fall into the same path as Portugal, everything would be just fine. The draw commenced in late November and began with Scotland and Wales filling in Path A for Pot 1. Then out came the invasion merchants for Path B, so now it was just Portugal, Sweden, and Italy left.
Sweden.
Oh, fuck. The nightmare had actually come true. The Azzurri would have to beat Cristiano Ronaldo's Portugal to qualify for the World Cup. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the national team lost the guy who had been carrying their attack to an ACL injury. So that went pretty much Italy's only source for goals. However, before any talks of this heavyweight battle could be made, Italy would have to beat North Macedonia at home first. The Spaghetti Mafia were significantly better than their opponents, but from the moment the whistle blew for kickoff, the mere thought of Portugal was making the Italians overlook the actual opponents in front of them. Italy were a nervous wreck. Within the first 10 minutes, they were already frantically moving the ball, and the proven Serie A goal scorers were firing blanks in the most spectacular of fashions. But despite Azzurri Immobile and Calabria and Zaha having a who can waste more chances contest, Italy was still applying tons of pressure and overwhelming their opposition. It was only just a matter of time that they would finally break North Macedonia.
Termina un surplus di spesa di energie. La conclusione e il gol di Trajkovski in pieno recupero.
Vergogna! È possibile che un giocatore come Immobile che fa 20 gol a stagione? Vergogna! Ha preso un gol da 30 metri e continuiamo a dire che è il migliore del mondo! Vergogna!
Just when you thought Italy couldn't outdo themselves, in a matter of less than a year, the national team went from kings of Europe to failing to qualify for the World Cup again after shitting the bed against North Macedonia at home. 32 shots and 0 goals. An absolute national embarrassment and an even bigger laughingstock internationally. And it really hasn't gotten any better since pissing the bed in Palermo. The Federation continued to put their faith in Mancini going forward, and he returned their trust by fucking off to Saudi Arabia in the middle of Euro 2024 qualifiers a year and a half later. He was then replaced by Luciano Spalletti, who was behind Napoli's dominating run to their third ever Scudetto just a few months prior. However, due to the lack of time he could spend with the squad, Spalletti was never able to replicate that with the national team. And after barely escaping their group, Italy crashed out in the last 16 of Euro 2024. Then, in Gli Azzurri's first World Cup 2026 qualifier, disaster unfolded yet again as Italy conceded 3 first-half goals to Norway. This would see Spalletti's time with the national team come to an end, and quite honestly, the Federation should have just put the job on LinkedIn cause no one wanted it. After numerous rejections though, Italy was left with 3 options, each worse than the next. Gennaro Gattuso was one option, which he's alright, I guess. Then there was Daniele De Rossi, who was pretty inexperienced and had just been sacked by Roma. And lastly, there was Fabio Cannavaro, a prime example that a player will not always translate to a coach, because this guy couldn't even win the Croatian league with Dinamo Zagreb. So in the end, Gattuso was chosen to lead the Italians back to glory. And to be fair, he hasn't done a bad job. In the return fixture versus Norway, Italy even got their lick. Italy has not qualified for the last 2 World Cups. Italy has not played in the World Cup knockout stage since 2006's final. In the same span of time, the kid behind this video featuring ideas like the Wii Phone and Xbox 720 is now a senior producer for Fortnite. On the surface, it seems like players feel this heavy weight of pressure on their shoulders that they simply cannot handle. Nowhere do you see that more than in their forwards. I mean, how the hell do you have your 2 most prolific strikers fail to score against North Macedonia? This isn't just one case though. Federico Chiesa's incredible carry job in Euro 2020 allowed many to ignore the blatant terrorism being committed by Ciro Immobile. Mind you, Ciro has scored 200 Serie A goals, but the moment he puts on that blue shirt, he becomes the second coming of Simone Zaza. There's also just been no one else to step up. If you look at the rest of the top national teams' goal scorer records, they've all been recently smashed by some ridiculous numbers. Except Italy. Gliazzurri's all-time top scorer is Gigi Riva, who holds the grand tally of 35 goals. Riva ended his national team career in 1974, by the way. Meanwhile, the number of players from the last decade in the rest of the top 10 scorers is 0. I'm not kidding. Italy's current active top scorer, Ciro Immobile, has half as many goals as a guy who played when Mussolini was still around. This is the pool Italy is working with though, a result of the youth development in this country, which right now is a complete fucking disaster. But you know what else is a complete disaster? The finances. Still, every club is currently drowning in so much debt, and average cash flow amongst TV rights and matchday revenue is far less than the Premier League, La Liga, and Bundesliga. In fact, the only significant revenue comes from UEFA competitions, which every major Italian club is doing all it can to stay in them, while the rest of the Italian clubs are doing all they can to survive the drop, as Serie B is pretty much death nowadays. I'm not exaggerating either. Since Fiorentina's demise in 2002, over 150 clubs have folded due to financial issues, and there's hundreds more flirting with the inevitable. And these dire situations have made Italian clubs significantly more susceptible to being sold to the most insane people imaginable.
I'm tired and sick of Reggiana being pushed around. I am frustrated and I'm freaking pissed off.
The former owner of the 1990-91 Scudetto winner Sampdoria was forced by his family to sell the club in 2014 to free himself of the mountains of debt incurred by the club. The person they sold it to ended up being another dumbass film producer who was committing mass amounts of fraud, and he nearly sent the club into bankruptcy by 2023. He no longer owns the club, but Sampdoria have continued to suffer and just avoided relegation to Serie C last season because Brescia, the club that finished below them, were hit with a 4-point deduction because of financial irregularities by their owner, who before buying the club in 2017 had been fined and banned by the English FA for breaching rules. You see what I mean? There's so little patience for financial support and short-term results alone to even think about developing youth.
What is it, Dexter? You don't know how to prompt the right cat? Go take care of your daughter, Dale.
So instead, we're seeing more players from abroad being naturalized as if they're Indonesia or Malaysia. And in terms of just any quality Italian youngsters in general, there is a concerning scarcity for them. And the ones out there right now are actively being fucked over just like their predecessors. Attacking midfielder Simone Pafundi played a big role in Italy's run to the final of the 2023 U20 World Cup. But ever since not being able to prove himself at the very provable age of 16, he's been sent to lone hell. In 2024, Italy won the U17 Euros with Mattia Liberali being named in the team of the tournament, and the highly touted Francesco Camarda being named player of the tournament. Liberali went on to make one appearance for Milan before being sold to a Serie B club, while Camarda was sent on loan to Lecce with an option to buy. What the fuck are we doing? But what truly encapsulates how badly young talents are neglected in this country, all you gotta do is look at Gigi Buffon. Buffon was one of the greatest keepers to ever play this sport. His legacy is a symbol in itself of security for the entire nation of Italy. However, his 17-year-old son Louis plays for his mother's country, Czechia, because not only Louis, but also Gigi himself believed it was better for his son's development to choose Czechia. Again, this is the son of an Italian legend. But that really goes to show how much financial pressure there is on these teams to get immediate results. And this scarcity for talent has genuinely turned Italy into a second-rate footballing nation with how the media and fans are so quick to hype mediocre talents because who the fuck else is there? But it doesn't have to continue this way. Atalanta, for example, has been seen as the model for youth development for quite a while now. Over the last decade, they've built a player training system around manager Gianpiero Gasparini's style of play. And this singular blueprint has made it easier to produce young talents and actually give them chances. If it works out, great. If it doesn't, the club can easily make a profit. Right now, there's multiple leagues with better financial situations. It's always going to be this way. Serie A clubs have the opportunity to use that to their advantage and attract attention from these richer folk. So ideally, if clubs can build around an identity with a long-serving coach, it could be a really cost-effective way to get around the constant pressure for short-term results. Alright, so now that Gasparini is gone, Atalanta might not be the best example anymore. But there is Bologna now. However, if Italy really wants to return to glory, they need an overhaul of the people who are currently pulling the strings. Because for years now, Lega Pro Serie A and the Federation have been constantly at each other's heads. The most notable conflict was right before Italy's playoff versus North Macedonia when Federation President Gabriele Gravina requested Serie A postpone a set of fixtures to give the national team more time to prepare. Lega Serie A responded by pretty much ignoring the Federation. In 2024, there were disputes between the Federation and Serie A club owners regarding reforms to the voting system for the next president of the Federation. It saw the lower leagues having a pretty significant chunk of the percentage of the votes in comparison to Serie A, which just so happened to work in favor of Gravina, who had previously been president of Serie C. Not that it really mattered that much because he still ran unopposed anyways, despite Italy not qualifying under his leadership either. For about the 80th time, no one has learned a damn thing. Because even though it was the exact reason why this sport catastrophically fell in the 2000s, people with positions of power in Italian football are still thinking about themselves and only themselves. It's even worse now because a lot of these guys are just bureaucrats, like in the case of Lazio owner Claudio Lotito, who is literally in the Senate. And in the small number of cases when there is someone who cares more about themselves and actually cares about the sport itself in the country, they're fucked over by said bureaucrats. In the early 2010s, Roberto Baggio was the FIGC sporting director and had many ideas for improving youth development in the country. However, instead of acting upon any of these reforms, the Federation just kept breaking promise after promise of allocating any funds for him. Baggio eventually got tired of this shit and left the role right before the 2014 World Cup. There have been more breakthroughs as of late though. Gigi Buffon back in 2023 was appointed as the national team delegation head, and just a few months ago, Giorgio Chiellini was elected as a representative on the Lega Serie A board. This is a step in the right direction, but it's gonna take a lot more than a few former players who care more about the national team than their own image to bring this program back to its very best. I mean, we don't even know if this country is gonna produce and or nurture any promising talent beyond the year of 2030. On top of all of this though, yes, there's more, everyone in Italian football needs to stop acting like a pathetic victim. Before Italy's last 2026 World Cup qualifier versus Norway, so many people were complaining about goal difference being a tiebreaker instead of head-to-head. And this was assuming that Italy had already walked out with the win. And a couple days before that game, Gennaro Gattuso was out here complaining about African and CONMEBOL qualifiers. Why the fuck can no Italian focus on the actual opponent in front of them?
I keep saying this, man. If something don't look right out there, blame it on me, right? If it don't look right, blame it on me. That's all you can do. Blame it on me. If your kids mess up at school, blame it on me. Car break down going to work, blame it on me.
It's like this country's entire scene still believes it's 2006, and once reality hits them like a truck for the 80th time, all they do is just bitch, moan, and complain about the fucking region of Oceania.
You know what it is? I'll tell you what it is. It's anti-Italian discrimination.
With Italy having to go through the playoffs in order to qualify for a third straight time, I don't think people realize how genuinely fucked Italian football is right now. No matter what happens in March, whether they qualify or not, I think it only gets so much worse until anything starts to show a drop of progress. It's finally done. It's finally over. Oh my god. Oh my god. This video, I have been putting together since the month of April. The scripts, the research, everything. I read articles on a subway just so I could work on this from time to time. The funny thing is though, because this was a video planned out in April, my main premise was just to talk about how Italy failed to qualify for 2018 and 2022. I did not actually expect them to do what they did in the final round of qualifiers. But anyways, if you reach this point, thank you so very much. These video essays are massive passion projects that, again, I'm really hoping to create more of later on into, I guess, my content creation life. I've been looking into more than just one editor simply because it's just not sustainable to do a long ass video essay or multiple video essays with just one editor, because I have to juggle still so many other things. I'm yapping too much here, but real quick, a massive shout out to my good friend Gabriele from J League Regista. This guy helps me a ton in really making sense of all of the mess that's going on in Italian football. So much love to Gabriele. He also writes a lot about the J-League, very in-depth articles as well, and if you're really into the J-League or wanting to get more into the J-League, I highly recommend checking out his website. I'll leave that in the description below. And of course though, a massive shout out to all our members, including Janos Balas, German Sayu 7, Jeremiah Owusu Ajimang, Django, Anazir Makalankam, Alex Rod, Kentra Agatra, Saint Terrence, Sylvia Citrus, Cheesebait, Winder Gel, Finn Likes Rugby More, Davox, The Portergeyser, Wise Orange, Polo Protos, Von Fan, Ghostly Owl, Coney Wolves, Lickstab, Mutanai, Apollo, Thrilling ADT13, Los Milos, La James Braun, Vecino, Napside, Money Cash Hose, Quantavious Pork, Lilia Lover, Stewed Monk, Red Yellow, Fuxi, MX Sand, Harry Maguire's Left Toenail, Flaquito, Thierry's Thoughts, Kev C, Dominic Griffin, Kyler Krebs, Mohammed Altanib, Nish, Patrick Barley, Rashford God 5, Raspberry Ale, and Unbroken Persona. If you'd like to become a member on the channel, there'll be a link down below and up in the annotations. You can follow my Twitter if you want, follow my Instagram if you like. If you remember the whole giveaway that I mentioned all the way back at the beginning of the video, don't forget, you could get a free trip to Japan. You can follow my Twitch, and because the video essay is finally over, I can actually figure out times that I can do some streaming. I will also be streaming the World Cup draws that are happening on December 5th, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't miss that out. That'll be on my Twitch. Again though, a big thank you for all the support throughout this entire year. Let's finish off strong, but until then, I'll see you guys. Ale, 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 for Italy, 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 fucking Italy!